Hi, everyone. All right, thanks for coming. Today's presentation is going to be on the SAT subject test for Math Level 2. And I'm actually not going to be presenting, but my friend Patrick will, and he scored a perfect 800 on his first try. So Patrick will now take it from here.
All right, hello guys. So I'm going to start sharing my screen real quick so you guys can all see the presentation. All right, so let's get into it. Hello everyone, thank you for coming. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. As Tina just said, I'm Patrick. I'm a junior at Brookline High School, and this is the presentation on the SAT Math 2 subject test. So first, let's start with some general information on subject tests. So subject tests, according to the College Board, are college admissions exams on specific subjects. These are the only national admission tests where you choose the tests that best showcase your strengths and interests. And so most colleges will only ask for 2 subject tests, so make sure you have at least 2 and that you have scores that you are satisfied with. Math comes in 2 levels, level 1 and level 2, and today we are talking about level 2. It is a very common subject test for high schoolers, and anybody that is looking to go into STEM should take it. I believe more than half of, or most of college-bound students have probably taken Math level 2. So this is my score report. As you can see, I took it in June of my sophomore year. I got an 800, and that placed me in the 79th percentile. I'll talk about what that percentile means a little bit more in a second. So now let's go into some general information on the SAT Math 2 subject test. So first, let's talk about the format. Like every subject test, it is 60 minutes long. It has 50 multiple choice questions. That means no short answer, no open response. Every question will have 5 options, A through E. The subjects are such: numbers and operations, algebra and functions, coordinate geometry, 3D geometry, trigonometry, and data analysis, statistics, and probability. So as you can see that essentially half the test is on algebra and functions. So if you're going to focus on anything, make sure you focus on that. And another big part of the test is geometry. If you sum together coordinate geometry, 3D geometry, and trigonometry, you get 13 to 18 questions, which is also a substantial amount. The questions are ordered based off difficulty from easy to hard, and that means when you're pacing yourself, make sure you spend less time on the first half of the test, and so you save more time for the second half of the test where the questions are harder. And lastly, calculators are permitted on this test. I will have a whole section later in this presentation talking about calculators. So next, let's talk about scoring. Like every subject test, it is scaled on a score of 200 to 800. And that score, scaled score, comes from your raw score, which is out of 50. For every question you get right, you get 1 point. There are penalties if you get a question wrong, but if you leave a question blank, it is 0 points. And so the formula for your raw score is the number of correct minus the number you get incorrect, rounded to the nearest whole number. So the scale will vary each test. That means it depends on the difficulty of that given test when you take it. And so there is no direct concrete conversion between raw score and scaled score. It will change every test. But generally, a raw score of 43 plus will get you a scaled score of 800. That means you don't even have to come close to getting everything right in order to get a perfect score on the test. This connects back to the 79th percentile that I got when I took the test, which means that 21% of people who took the Math 2 when I took it got a full score, and that is a very substantial amount. So here is a approximate raw score to scaled score conversion chart. I'll give you guys a second to look at that, and then we'll move on. Okay, so now we're going to go into the content of the test. So the content covered on the SAT Math 2 subject test is everything through pre-calculus, which you should be taking in your junior year. So there's a lot of content covered on this test, so I've grouped it into some broad categories, which I will not go in depth into each topic, but I will list a few key things that I believe are important to know. So firstly, we have this image, and it is the information that is given to you at the beginning of the SAT Math 2. And as you can see, you have the formula for a cone, formula for the volume of a cone, volume of a sphere, volume of a pyramid, and surface area of a sphere. So the SAT Math 2 does not give you a lot of formulas to work with, which means you will have to memorize every other formula that you will need for this test. So first, let's go talk about algebra. These are your fundamentals that you must know. So you have operations, which are addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, exponents, and roots, and expressions, equations, and inequalities. You should know how to work with these, how to manipulate them, and how to solve for any variables. I know this is super basic, but these are the fundamentals that you will be using to solve almost every question on the test. Next, let's talk about linear, quadratic, and polynomial functions. These are your bread and butter functions. Firstly, there are some basics about function you must know. You must be familiar with odd and even functions, an inverse of a function, and how to combine functions. These don't only apply to these three types of functions, but every other type of function that is on the test as well. Firstly, we have linear functions. You guys are probably very familiar with these, so I won't talk about them much, but a few key terms are the y and x intercepts and slope, and also be familiar with the different forms of equation, such as standard, point slope, and slope intercept form. Next, we have quadratics. You guys are also probably very familiar with these, and it is important to know the quadratic formula, how to complete the square, and know what the discriminant is, and what it tells you about the quadratic. And then we have higher degree polynomials. For these, you should know how to do synthetic division in order to find roots, know sums and differences of cubes, for example, how to factor x cubed minus 27, and know the terms multiplicity and the fundamental theorem of algebra, and how they relate to the roots of a polynomial. Let's go through a practice problem that will show maybe how one of these subjects will show up on the test. As you can see, this is question 6, so it is one of the easiest on the test. And the question goes as such. The sum of zeros of f of x equals 3x squared minus 5 is. So you should know that the standard equation of a quadratic is ax squared plus bx plus c, and that the sum of zeros for a quadratic is negative b over a. In this case, for this equation, negative b over a equals 0. But alternatively, if you did not know that the sum of zeros of a quadratic is negative b over a, you could have graphed it on a calculator to find the zeros, set the equation equal to 0 and solve it algebraically, or recognize the graph will be symmetrical across the y-axis. And so either way, no matter what method you use, you get e, the sum of the zeros is 0. And so as you can see, there are many ways to go about solving each problem, but certainly some ways are faster than others. And there are many tips, little tricks or formulas that you can use to find the answer of these questions fast. So now let's talk about all the other functions on this test, and there are quite a few. First, we have exponential functions. Know the form of the equation of this function, and be familiar with rates of growth and decay. There's also logarithmic functions. Be familiar with operations with logarithms, such as multiplying or dividing, or adding and subtracting logarithms, and know the change of base formula. Next, we have rational functions. There are a few key terms. limits, limits and horizontal and vertical asymptotes, as well as holes, which I don't have on here. And next we have piecewise functions. These include absolute value functions and step functions. And lastly, we have parametric equations, which you should know how to eliminate the parameter for these. And for all the functions, know how to transform them, such as translations, reflections, and vertical and horizontal compression. And for all these functions, you should know the standard equations of these functions and their properties. So let's go into a practice problem. This problem is question 41, so it is one of the harder questions on the test, and this question deals with rational functions. Which of the following lines are asymptotes for the graph of y equals 3x squared minus 13x minus 10 over x squared minus 4x minus 5? And so what we want to do first is factor out the numerator and denominator to get that y equals 3x plus 2 times x minus 5 over x plus 1 times x minus 5. So as you can see from this equation, both the numerator and denominator have x minus 5. So if you first look at this equation, you might think that x equals -1 and x equals 5 might be vertical asymptotes, but since x minus 5 is both on the numerator and denominator, there is a hole at x minus 5, not a vertical asymptote. X equals 5, not a vertical asymptote. And so if you factor out x minus 5 from the top and bottom, you get this equation instead, 3x plus 2 over x plus 1. So this means that x equals -1 is a vertical asymptote. So next we have to look for horizontal asymptotes. And to find horizontal asymptotes, we divide the leading coefficients of the equation. And if you do that, it is 3 divided by 1. You get 3, so y equals 3 is a horizontal asymptote. And so your answer is D, options 1 and 3. Next, let's talk about coordinate geometry. We already talked about lines, so I won't talk about them again. You should also know conic sections. These include parabolas, ellipses, hyperbolas, and circles. A couple key terms relating to conic sections are foci, major and minor axes, vertices, the directrix, and eccentricity. Also know the standard equation of each conic section and the properties of each conic section, as well as how to transform, so translations, rotations, reflections, and dilations. And yeah. Lastly, we have polar coordinates. Be familiar with the polar coordinate plane and how to graph on it, as well as how to convert between rectangular coordinates and polar coordinates. So let's go into another example problem. This one deals with polar coordinates. So this is question 48, so one of the hardest on the test. And it goes, the area of the region enclosed by the graph of the polar curve r equals 1 over sine theta plus cosine theta, and the x and y axes is. So what I would do first on this question is multiply both sides by sine theta plus cosine theta to get r sine theta plus r cosine theta equals 1. And from here, it is important to know that r sine theta equals y and r cosine theta equals x when you're converting between polar and rectangular coordinates. And so if you substitute, you get x plus y equals 1. And this line forms a triangle with a base of 1 and a height of 1 with the x and y axes. And using the triangle area formula, 1/2 base times height, we get that the area of the triangle is 0.5. So your answer is B. All right, next let's talk about geometry. There isn't too much need to know about 3D geometry, and remember that there will only be a few questions on this subject, but know the formulas for the surface area and volumes of solids. These include rectangular prisms, triangular prisms, cylinders, spheres, cones, and pyramids. and be familiar with the 3D coordinate plane, which has the X, Y, and Z axes, and how to graph on this 3D plane, and how to find distance and midpoints between 2 points on the 3D coordinate plane. And so we have another example problem. The length of the radius of the sphere, x squared plus y squared plus z squared plus 2x minus 4y equals 10 is. And so firstly, for this question, you need to know the standard equation of the sphere, which is x squared minus h plus y squared minus k plus z squared minus l, and equals r squared. And so if we complete the square for this equation in order to get it into the standard equation form, this is what we get. And so r squared equals 15. And from there, we take the square root of that. So root 15 equals 3.87, which is the radius of the sphere. So your answer is E. Next, let's go into trigonometry. So the most important thing to know are the 6 basic trigonometric functions: sine, cosine, tangent, secant, cosecant, and cotangent. Also useful information are the Pythagorean identities. For example, that sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And be familiar with cofunction identities, which basically state that cofunctions of complementary angles are equivalent, and know the double angle formulas. Next, we have solving triangles. That means given enough information on one triangle, you are able to find every other side length and angle on that triangle. And you should know you should recognize an ambiguous case. So given an side-side angle triangle, you should be able to determine whether there are 1, 2, or 0 possible triangles. Be familiar with the law of sines and cosines. These are extremely useful for solving triangles, and know special angles and the values of the respective trigonomic functions. These special angles are multiples of 30 degrees and 45 degrees. Lastly, we have radians, degrees. Be familiar with both of them, know how to work with both of them, and how to convert between the two. And also make sure that your calculator is in the right mode when you're solving these problems. Graphing trig functions, you should know how to graph each of the trig functions as well as the inverse trig functions, and know how to work with the amplitude, period, and phase shift. That means recognizing them given an equation, but also knowing how to change them in a given equation. So we have a practice problem with trigonometry. In JKL, sine L equals 1/3, sine J equals 3/5, and JK equals root 5 inches. The length of KL in inches is, and so a diagram you can quickly draw might look like this. It can be helpful. And for this question is testing you on the law of sines. So you must use that to solve the question. And so the law of sines states that sine L over JK equals sine J over KL. And if you plug in values given in the question, you get that 1/3 over root 5 equals 3/5 over KL. And if you solve for KL using cross multiplication or however you want to do it, you get that KL equals 4.0. So your answer is, oh, sorry, my bad. The answer is not C, it is E. Sorry about that. So next we have probability and statistics. So first, let's talk about probability. You should be familiar with conditional probability. That means conditional probability is the chance that one event occurs given that another event occurs. You should be able to tell when two events are independent. That means that the probability of one event does not depend on the probability of another event. And lastly, we have disjunction and conjunction. So disjunction is the probability that whether that A or B occurs. and conjunction is the probability that A and B occur. So be familiar with those terms for probability. Next, we have statistics. Some common terms that you should be familiar with are mean, median, mode, range, standard deviation, and z-scores. So those all should be terms that you already know. If you don't know what a z-score is, it is how many standard deviations a value is from the mean. And you should be familiar with models. A model can be of any type of function that we've discussed earlier, and it is also useful to know how to find a regression line using your calculator. Last thing you should know for statistics are the types of graphs and plots that might show up. And a third thing that kind of ties in with probability and statistics is counting. These questions might contain Venn diagrams where you have to find missing values. And they also pertain to permutations and combinations. And so remember that in permutations, order matters, whereas in combinations, order does not matter. So we have an example problem. This problem combines probability and counting. A committee of 5 people is to be selected from 6 men and 9 women. The selection is made randomly. What is the probability that the committee consists of 3 men and 2 women? And so first we want to find the number of ways to select 3 men out of 6 men, which is 6 times 5 times 4. And remember, you have to divide by 3 factorial because we are talking about combinations, so order does not matter. And so dividing by 3 factorial will get rid of any repeats. Next, we have ways to select 2 women, which is out of 9 women, which is 9 times 8 divided by 2 factorial. And the ways to select 5 people out of 15 people is 15 times 14 times 13 times 12 times 11 divided by 5 factorial. And so if we multiply the number of ways to select 3 men and 2 women and divide it by the total number of ways to select 5 people, we get this equation. And if you type it into your calculator, do it out, you get 240 over 1001. A shortcut, very useful for this question, is the combinations function on your calculator. It can save you a lot of time if you just type it in, or it might not save you that much time because typing in all this information to your calculator does not take that much more time. But either way, you get your answer B, 240 over 1001. So the last topic is numbers. Under this category, there are a whole variety of topics that aren't necessarily super related to each other, but we have complex numbers, so that means numbers with I in them that have I in them. So remember that I is the square root of -1. Be familiar with the powers of I, as well as how to do math with complex numbers and graphing complex numbers. Next, we have vectors. A couple key terms to know about vectors are the norm, which is essentially how long a vector is, the dot product, which can tell you whether 2 vectors are perpendicular, and the resultant, which is essentially adding 2 vectors together. Next, we have matrices. Be familiar with matrix addition and subtraction, as well as multiplication. There are 2 types of matrix multiplication, scalar and matrix multiplication. So be familiar with those 2 types of multiplication. And be familiar with determinants. Lastly, also, matrices can be used to solve systems of equations, which is something that might also appear on the test. And lastly, we have sequences in series. So you should know how to be familiar with sigma notation and how to do summations, and be familiar with both arithmetic and geometric sequences. Arithmetic sequences are where between terms a constant is being added, and geometric is where between terms it is being multiplied by a constant. So here we have a practice problem. The third term of an arithmetic sequence is 15, and the 7th term is 23. What is the first term? And so first you should realize that terms 7 and 3 are 4 terms apart, and the difference between the two terms is 8. 8 divided by 4 is 2. That means the constant being added between terms is 2. And so in order to find the first term, we subtract 4 from 15 to get 11. So our answer is D. Let's do a second example problem, because since all these topics aren't super related, this question is about vectors. So a unit vector parallel to vector v, 2, -3, 6 is a vector. And so the question asks for a unit vector. And so that means the length of the vector is 1. To find the length of a vector, you take the x component squared plus the y component squared plus the z component squared and take the square root of that. And so right off the bat, you should recognize that a and b are not unit vectors. So you can eliminate those two answers. And if two vectors are parallel to each other, that means they're multiples of each other. So that means we can say some constant k times vector v will give us our unit vector. And so we multiply vector v by constant k, that will either yield a vector whose x component is positive, y component is negative, and z component is positive, or a vector whose x component is negative, y component is positive, and z component is negative. And so if we look at those two forms, or those two signs for each component, we find that C is the only one that fits. And so our answer is C. So as you can see, you did not have to do an extremely a lot of math to solve this problem, and that actually sometimes eliminating answers can help can be a lot easier than solving the question mathematically. So sorry, this is awkward because I might have messed up the presentation a little bit, but here are the functions that you must know. I took these pages out of one of my textbooks. As you can see, there's a lot, but most of these you will be already familiar with. So I'll give you a second to take a look at these, and we'll move on. There's another page. There are more functions. I know it's a lot, but I'll give you some time to look at these as well. All right, now we're going to go into some strategies, tips, and my experience taking the SAT Math 2 subject test. So here are some strategies. Let's start with some studying strategies. Make sure you it should go without saying that you should be studying for the test before, at least a while before you're taking the test, because you don't want to wait till the last second, because you also have to balance school, homework, and extracurriculars with these activities. And so make sure you give yourself enough time to be familiar with the test and the content on it. How much time you need to study varies from person to person, but keep in mind, once again, keep in mind that you do have to balance a lot on top of studying for this test. Make sure you take tests regularly. This is the best way to get prepared and familiar with the test. When I took the test, I took many practice tests. When I was studying for the test, I took many practice tests. But when you're taking a practice test, a diagnostic test can be helpful. It can tell you where you are with the content before you start any studying, and it can also be used to track any improvement you are making. And make sure you time your tests and do them in an environment that most simulates a test-taking environment. This will get you accustomed to what it will be like during test day. And as you can see from this presentation, that there's a lot of content covered on the test. And so a strategy that is highly recommended is targeted practice. That means taking a test, taking a practice test and going back, looking at which problems you got wrong and focusing on those specific topics. because there's so much content covered on the test, you don't want to waste too much time on stuff you're already very familiar with. So next, let's go into some test taking strategies. First, you should read each question carefully. Make sure you know what the question is asking. If you do not read a question carefully, you might end up solving for X when the question is asking for something totally different. Next is a strategy you're probably all very familiar with, process of elimination. It can be easier to eliminate all the wrong answers instead of looking for the right one in certain scenarios. But if you are not able to narrow it down to only one answer, process of elimination can also help you with guessing. If you are able to eliminate 2, 3 options, then your chances of guessing the correct answer go up immensely. But be warned that there are penalties for incorrect answers, so guessing can sometimes be risky. But if you are able to eliminate 2 or 3 options, then guessing can be a good choice. Next, if a question has a variable in it, sometimes it can be useful to plug in a concrete value for that variable so that you're working with concrete values rather than variables, which can sometimes feel a little bit more abstract and difficult to work with. If a question has a function in it, sometimes it can be useful to use your calculator to graph out the functions. From there, you can find many key characteristics of that function, but also be warned that sometimes graphing a calculator can actually take more time, and it is, in many cases, not the most efficient way to go about a question. If a question is too hard, skip it. Remember, you only have 60 minutes for 50 questions, so you definitely don't want to be spending 5 minutes on a single question because that time could have been used to answer multiple other questions. So pacing yourself, this ties into pacing yourself. Remember that the first half of the test will have easier questions than the second half of the test, and so pace your time accordingly. A recommended strategy is to go through the whole test doing all the questions that you know, skip any questions that you feel will take time or are too hard or you don't know how to do it, and then come back a second time around and do the questions you skipped. And lastly, you want to trust your answer. Do not doubt your answer if you don't have a reason to. If the stress and anxiety this will cause will hurt you later on in the test when you're solving other problems. So if you do your calculations, put down an answer and just stick with it, move on. So next, let's talk about calculators. So make sure you study and take practice tests with the calculator you intend to use, so you know you intend to take the test with. The calculator should be a graphing calculator, not a 4-function calculator, because a 4-function calculator will not do enough for you on the test. And the College Board has a calculator policy that you can find online, and it will have a list of acceptable graphing calculators. Like I said, make sure you're familiar with the calculator before the test. A calculator is only useful if you know how to use it. So know the functions on your calculator, what it can do, what each button does, how to graph, and other skills. But it is also important to recognize when is a good time to use your calculator, when it will save you time, when it will take up too much time. So bring backup batteries. I know the chance of your calculator running out of battery on test day is extremely low, but it is better to be safe than sorry. And lastly, check the mode. I know I mentioned this before, but it is important to emphasize that when you are doing problems involving angles or trigonometry, make sure you are in the right mode, radians or degrees. It is a shame to do all the right calculations, but get the wrong answer because your calculator is on the wrong mode. And the College Board will throw in answers there, trick answers to test whether you are using the right mode on your calculator. So next, let's talk about some important calculator functions. So firstly, we have graphing. Be familiar with graphing, know how to graph on your calculator, and it is this extremely important skill. but not only graph, know how to find the key characteristics of the function you're graphing, such as intersections, minimums, maximums, intercepts, how to trace the graph, and how to find the point of a given x value. Conics are on the test, remember, so know how to graph conics. Sometimes it will have the form y equals plus or minus square root of something, and so you should be familiar with that format. Next, we have the solve function. It can solve any function with any equation with a single variable in it. So this is an extremely useful function. If you do not know how to use it, please go onto YouTube and find a tutorial on how to use it. It can save you so much time on the test. And lastly, the solve function is under the math menu, but be familiar with all the other menus and functions that can be found under the math and matrix in the math and matrix menus. These can contain very useful functions that can help you solve many problems and save you a lot of time on the test. So lastly, I want to talk about my experience and tips I have for you on the test. So remember, I took the test when I was a sophomore in 10th grade. That means I was in Algebra 2 and had not yet learned any of the content in pre-calc. So that means I had to self-study all that content. For any sophomores watching this presentation, that will be similar to what you will have to do. But if you are a junior, this process, the studying process will be a lot easier because you most likely are already familiar with all of these topics from class. So when I started studying about 2 months in advance. Sounds like a lot of time, but remember, I had to balance it with school, homework, and extracurriculars. I took about 1 to 2 practice tests per week, and I think this is generally a good amount. Maybe the 1 test a week I feel like is the minimum you should be taking. Any more wouldn't hurt. And when I studied, I used the Barron's and Princeton Reviews textbooks. This does not pertain only to the math too. I prefer Barron's and Princeton Review for any standardized testing that I take, and I feel like these 2 books really helped me in my studying process. Lastly, on test day, something I highly value is mindset, and so make sure you prepare all your documents and materials the night before and arrive to the test center a bit early. You want to minimize the stress that you're experiencing on test day. The last thing you want is more anxiety. All right, that brings us to the end of this presentation. If you guys have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box and I will answer them. How similar is the practice test to the actual test? So I feel like the practice tests in your textbook do simulate the actual test pretty well. I was told that the test in the Barron's textbook may be a little bit harder than the actual test, and I certainly found that to be the case. But overall, I feel like the practice tests are very helpful in getting you a feel of how the actual test will be. Will the slideshow be available publicly for future reference? Yes, I believe this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted online. I can also, yeah. Do you know if percentile is based on the score or if it is also based on the number of questions you get right or wrong? The percentile is based on the score, I believe. Yeah, I believe it's based on the score, not the number of questions you got right or wrong. Are subject tests administered at the same time as general SATs? I believe sometimes they are. Sometimes the SAT test dates will offer both general SAT and subject tests, but other times it might be only general SAT or only subject tests.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then we'll wrap up this session. Thanks everyone for coming, and if you're interested, we might be hosting more SAT or AP sessions. So just I'll be sending out some emails, but you can also check out my website. And I want to say just thank you again to anyone who donated to my fundraiser for the Mass General Hospital. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great week.